Welcome to today's lecture on influenza, the immune system, and the respiratory system. We're really glad that you've joined us today because during this presentation we're going to be looking at some very important subjects, one of which you may have been made aware of over the past several years, and that is that there is a looming epidemic, a very dangerous disease that is on the horizon of many researchers and scientists. And it's already around even now, but the implications for its mutation and its growth and its detriment are very much in the news today. What are we going to be talking about specifically? Well, that is influenza. Now, is this concern and fear of influenza justifiable? Let's take a look at a newspaper clipping from October 4, 1918. Death toll and sick list is one of the heaviest on record, reported here in this little paper from Vermont. It says practically every state in the Union is affected, innumerable cases in the county. What is this talking about? This is talking about the 1918 Spanish Avian Influenza. This paper went on to mention several things, such as the loss of both of the town doctors, the instigation of a martial-type law, curfews, restrictions, and many other things enforced to try to keep this epidemic suppressed as much as possible. However, all of these things could not really stem the tide of the detriment this had on the whole world. In fact, 30 to 50 million people lost their lives. That's more people than died total as casualties in World War I. So more people died because of the influenza virus of 1918 than died in World War I. That is astounding. Now, there are some other influenza pandemics that have kind of swept the world, not as detrimental as the 1918 pandemic. In 1957, we had the Asian flu with roughly 1 million deaths. In 1968, we had the Hong Kong flu, which was about 750,000 deaths. And researchers are actually saying that about every 100 years or so, we will have a repeat of the influenza virus, which kills as many people as the Spanish influenza, if not more, which is just as virulent, just as dangerous, if not more dangerous, than that which killed 50 million people in 1918. In fact, if one of these new influenza viruses surfaced today, researchers speculate that anywhere between 180 and 360 million deaths would occur if death rates reached the equivalent of the 1918 pandemic. This influenza virus reached almost every part of the world, except for a few isolated Pacific islands. So this was extremely widespread. And the pandemic that is coming, the pandemic that is just coming in a matter of time, it's not a question even of if, the question really is when. Now, this should not really come as a surprise to us. To those who are studying and watching unto prayer, those that are following on to know the Lord, we're told that the time we're living in is short and that many of these things will come upon us. In fact, in a magazine article published in the Review and Herald in 1902, we find this admonition: the plagues of God are already beginning to be poured out upon the earth. The evidences before us indicate that God's Spirit is being withdrawn from the earth. Only a little while longer shall we be permitted to labor, and then in heaven it will be said, "It is done." It will be all over. But before it's all over, we will go through many pandemics, many epidemics, many diseases, many disasters. In Testimonies, Volume 7, page 135, we find basically the reason why all of these diseases are coming upon us. It reads, "The time is near when, because of the iniquity of the fallen race, the whole animal creation will groan under the diseases that curse our earth." We are having this taking place today. We are groaning under diseases today. Many, many people are perishing for lack of knowledge and prevention and treatment in God's healing way. And many people are not being taught how to stay away from these upcoming epidemics. But God's way is a lot different than man's way. Whereas man will wait until a person falls into a ditch to get them out, God will cover over that ditch and prevent them from actually falling into it. How do I know that? Because in Proverbs 27:12, we find this admonition, that a prudent man sees danger approaching. And when he sees the danger approaching, he hides himself, or he takes measures to prevent coming in contact with this danger, or having this danger become a reality in his own life. But the simple man, or the unlearned man, passes on. He's not concerned about prevention. He says, well, if it comes near me, maybe then I'll deal with it when it comes. But is this the way that God works? I'll submit to you it's not. Because it says that simple man passes on and is punished. Harm occurs. That speculation that it may come and I'll handle it when it comes has now become a reality, and harm has already occurred. Wouldn't it be wise for us then to understand how we can prevent influenza, particularly the most virulent strain of influenza and most deadly strain of influenza that is predicted to come upon this world? Shouldn't we be preparing if it could happen any time? I think we should be ready. And to get ready today, we're going to be looking at a few key areas of anatomy and physiology first, to prepare us to understand how these can work in terms of prevention. First, we're going to look at the respiratory system and give a brief overview. Now, this overview does not negate studying and studying to show thyself approved unto God. And if you have any questions that are raised through this presentation, I know you're not in a classroom setting where you can raise your hand and ask, but you can study to show yourself approved, to get the right answer, to come to the truth. Don't leave any stone unturned to find the answers to your questions. But the respiratory system is a very, very miraculous, marvelous system. It consists of two separate areas and one basic physiological function. We have the upper respiratory tract, we have the lower respiratory tract, and we have the process of respiration. First, we're going to start with the spiritual application behind this system. Now, if you were to take the respiratory system, which consists of the trachea going into bronchioles and all the way down into the alveoli. If you turn it upside down, this is not the normal way of looking at things. This is an upside down person. But if you turn it upside down, it looks a lot like a tree. And in fact, in many ways, this truly is the tree of life in your body. Because without an adequate supply of oxygen, your life will most assuredly end rather quickly. This tree it's very amazing little tree that gathers nutrients from its branches, so to speak, the oxygen. It also lets off carbon dioxide, and it's kind of like a cleansing tree as well. Just as trees outdoors. They take in carbon dioxide, they give out oxygen. Our respiratory tree takes in oxygen and gives off carbon dioxide. So we have this symbiotic relationship with nature as well. Now the upper airway, that was the lower airway. The upper airway very much is a protector of the tree of life. We see we have the nasal cavity, we have the palate, which separates the mouth from the nasal sinuses, and this area really is kind of a warming and a filtering station for the air that will be traveling down into the lower airways. Over here in the back of the tongue, we have the pharynx. The epiglottis is a wonderful little device that actually folds down over the larynx when you swallow. For when you swallow, things need to go down the esophagus. That's a little tube that goes into the stomach. But if you note, there are two open passages here. So how does the food know to go down the right pathway? Well, when you swallow, the esophagus is open, but the larynx closes off due to the epiglottis folding down and shutting over like a trap door whenever you swallow. It's really an amazing, amazing system. If you think about it, every single time you swallow, that is happening. Let's take another look at the lower airways. The epiglottis is almost like a sword turning either which way, which is referenced in Genesis 3:24. We take a look here at the lower airways. We see the characteristics here. In fact, we have two lobes, or two divisions of the lung on the left side, and we have three lobes on the right side of the lung. Now, why is that? Well, if you notice on the left section of the lung, you actually have a notch embedded into the lung itself. That is because the lungs sit within a cavity of the body known as the thoracic cavity, and every little organ is packed in a particular way. The heart is actually packed right up against the left side of the lungs, and so that's why there's only really room for two lobes in the left side of the lung. Your heart is actually right there, right underneath of the lung, and the two work together very, very closely. Now, if we take a look at the very, very minute passages here in the lungs, we find something very interesting. This is diagrammed over here on the side of the slide. We can see the alveoli here. Alveoli are very much like clusters of grapes. And the alveoli are the small functional units of the human airway. In fact, if we were to actually take a look microscopically, this is what the alveoli would look like. And the air passes into the alveoli, and it's stationary there for just a few moments, and then it's exhaled out. So you have kind of like a tide coming in and going out, coming in and going out. And what is this tide doing? Well, you have the physiological function of respiration. Ventilation is the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. You see, when the tide goes out, when we exhale from the lungs, we are putting out carbon dioxide, which is really a waste product of our metabolism. Oxygen is actually brought back into the lungs. With every inhalation, you have a higher concentration of oxygen brought back in. Now, of course, the cardiovascular system takes this oxygen and brings the carbon dioxide back to the lungs. And this exchange of gases in the lungs actually takes place right there in the alveoli. In fact, if you're to take a look at this next slide, you'll notice that in the alveoli, you have something going on. You have a blood supply that's passing over the surfaces of the alveoli, and this is actually allowing carbon dioxide to be put out into the gaseous contents of the alveoli, and it allows oxygen to be brought back in and put into the red blood cells, which transport, through the use of hemoglobin, this oxygen to the rest of the body. So it's a very remarkable system. Now, this is not the most remarkable part of the human airway. In fact, if we take another look at the way this airway is structured, we find that the airway is very, very highly protected. The alveoli is the place where the most important function of breathing takes place, the actual exchange of the gases, but the lungs themselves, and the upper respiratory system included, is designed to protect and to enable this process to take place. Starting with the larynx is a protective hard cartilage that basically right there at your throat helps to keep this airway open. Going down over to the trachea is a reinforced tube, basically that's designed to be very, very rigid and hold that airway open and protect that valuable passageway there to the lungs. And then you have the little notch there where the bronchi bifurcate or split off. That's known as the carina. Have you ever had a cough? Well, this area here, from the carina down a little bit and actually up a little bit up the trachea, this area is filled with nerve cells. And when these nerve cells are irritated, it triggers a reflex known as the cough reflex. So it's really the lungs' way of saying, okay, there's something here, it's an irritating substance, we need to get it out of the lungs, and so you have a cough. So that's a protective mechanism there. There are other protective mechanisms which we'll go over in just a moment on our next slide. But just keep in mind, every single component of the lungs has its own protective mechanism. And so wouldn't it stand to reason that we need to optimize these protective mechanisms in the lungs in order to prevent this influenza from really coming our way and actually doing us damage? One of the most protective mechanisms in general in the human airway is its tissue, its surface tissue. The reason why is because the tissue lining the airway, human airway, is known as the airway epithelium cells or epithelial cells. These cells are very unique because they work together to basically move contaminants out of the lungs. We have the top layer of the cells, the tissue, the epithelium, which actually is called ciliated cells, or are called ciliated cells, and they have hair-like projections on their outer surface. These hair-like projections actually move. It's like a kind of like if you can visualize wind blowing a field of wheat. Kind of the movement that you see, the gust and the movement of the wheat is similar to the movement of the cilia, but the cilia will always move upward. They'll always blow upward. They're actually trying and attempting to bring things up out of the airways. Now, normally gravity would pull things down. In fact, if your cilia cells are not working, then you're going to end up with fluid collecting in the bottom of your lungs and debris collecting in the bottom of your lungs because of gravity. But God has placed in the airway a mechanism whereby waste products and fluid can be brought up out of the lungs, kind of like a conveyor belt. Now, the cilia would not function effectively if there was not some kind of sticky material that things could get trapped to and then actually moved up through this conveyor belt system, so that you can cough it up or so on. Ciliated cells are provided nutrients by serous cells, or the goblet cells, in other words. These actually the ciliated cells from drying out. They secrete something called mucus, and this mucus actually helps to adhere things to the cilia, and you actually can cough up things coated in mucus because the cilia have the mucus as basically a glue that they're allowed to capture things with. Underneath of the goblet cells, you have cells known as basal cells. These basal cells basically provide the raw materials needed for mucus production. What are some of those raw materials? Well, the human body is 60% water by weight. So it stands to reason there's going to be a lot of water used in mucus itself. It's a thick liquid, but nevertheless it is a liquid. And so these do have quite a bit of water that they put out. We're going to go and take a look now. Since we've gotten this information, we're going to take a look and see how influenza affects this system. Influenza primarily attacks the human epithelial airway cells, what we see right here in the previous diagram. Now looking at this again, take another look at this airway. We find that infection can actually destroy the layers of this tissue. Think about this. If you had a destruction of the ciliated cell, what would happen? Well, you would have to cough up probably a lot of mucus because your cilia is not really working very effectively. The cilia is not going to be capturing things very effectively. You may have some inflammation and irritation in the lungs, so you will have it if you have an influenza infection. But let's say the influenza virus was able to penetrate down even into the mucus-producing cells, and it destroyed these as well. What would you have then? Well, you have things like a lot of liquid, a lot of edema, liquid buildup in the lungs, because these raw materials producing cells that would supply these raw materials to the mucus production cells are now leaking out into the lungs. And without the cilia working, they're going to go straight to the bottom. So influenza in the lower airways can be very dangerous. So we want to keep it confined to the upper airways if we can. Basically, when we look at this whole diagram, we find something very interesting. That is that influenza can be very dangerous in the lower airways. Now in upper airways, if you have a runny nose, it's not too much of a problem. The gravity would probably even bring it out forward, or if you start to feel it in the back of your throat, you can easily spit it out. Looking at this slide, we see contrasted here H1N1 and H5N1. Now H1N1 is a normal H1N1, normal human influenza. This is not talking about swine flu, which is an abnormal version of H1N1. The normal human influenza is confined usually to the upper airways. Why is that? Because it's cooler here. And normal human influenza grows best in the cooler environments below 95 degrees Fahrenheit. However, H5N1 is an avian or bird mutant influenza. Birds are actually much higher temperature, generally speaking, than humans, up to 105 to 106, even higher degrees Fahrenheit in terms of their internal body temperature. So when you have a mutant avian influenza, there is a risk that this influenza is not going to act like normal human influenza and confine itself to the upper airways, where it's less dangerous, but it's going to go as quickly as possible down to the lungs, where it causes massive tissue destruction and in many cases death. As I said before, the H1N1 that is commonly referred to as swine flu actually has one of these bird genes in its structure. It's actually a combination not just of swine and human, but of bird as well. It should just be called bird, swine, and human flu instead of swine flu. This actually helped the mutant H1N1 virus to grow better down in the lungs. This is why researchers were thinking it could be so deadly. They thought this might be the one, but I'm very thankful that this has not been the one. But we should take note and be warned that the one that they are fearing, the one that the world is looking for in terms of this influenza pandemic, is on the horizon. We need to be preparing ourselves. Some of the symptoms, published symptoms of swine flu, include fever or chills, headache, nasal congestion or runny nose, sore throat, cough, body aches or lethargy, lack of appetite, nausea or vomiting, and diarrhea. The key diagnostic criteria for swine flu or for influenza in general is a sudden onset of profound tiredness or malaise. And in swine flu, there are a few symptoms that are a little bit different, a little new, and that is with the gastrointestinal symptoms, such as the nausea and vomiting and diarrhea. These are not generally characteristic of regular human influenza. Why is that? Well, because this type of influenza grows well even in the digestive tract. It can grow, it can replicate, it can kill tissue there because it can survive at a higher temperature. I'm going to show you some statistics here. Moving back a couple slides. Heat and avian influenza. With this swine flu in 2009 that we had come about, 30% of initially reported cases of swine flu in Mexico were without fever. 50% of all confirmed cases in Chile were without fever. And avian influenza thrives in a warmer environment, a feverish state. So it's interesting to note that many people's immune systems were able to detect the fact that this virus was able to thrive in a feverish state, and their body did not initiate a fever response. This is a healthy immune response here, that the immune system was able to detect this and not raise the body's temperature. How does fever come about in general? Well, in terms of influenza, we have a process going on here. We have interleukin 1 and 6, which are both communicatory chemicals that are put out by the white blood cells. And that happens in a response to viral activity, or other types of invaders can initiate the release of these two chemicals. But what interleukin 1 and 6 do in terms of the fever response is they activate a pathway, a series of chemical reactions known as the arachidonic acid pathway. What happens after that? Well, the arachidonic acid pathway ends up turning up the body's thermostat, which is the hypothalamus. And so when you turn up your heater at home using your thermostat, what happens next? Well, the heater comes on, right? And you have some energy produced, and you have the energy transferred to other parts of the house. The same thing happens in the body. Sympathetic nervous system is activated. You have vasoconstriction, which is just your exterior vessels in your arms and limbs are constricting, so you can conserve more heat. The liver produces a lot more heat. It heats up very, very much, maybe even up to 108 degrees. And you start to shiver. Your muscles start to produce heat as well. And so the heater turns on, and the circulatory system takes that heat throughout the whole body. And it keeps it inside as far internal as possible, so that you keep this heat and you build up more heat. Now, fever is a very, very good and beneficial response for human influenza, but it is a horrible response for a virus that thrives in a feverish state. We'll take a look here at a cell culture that was taken for normal human influenza, and another one here for avian or the bird type influenza. And what we find here is very interesting. and that is that human influenza, after 72 hours of growth at the 32 degrees Celsius, which is approximately 89 degrees or 90 degrees Fahrenheit. This is the temperature of upper airways in cooler climates. It grew very readily, very, very readily. You see the whole slide covered with this influenza. But if you look down at avian influenza, the 32 degrees Celsius or approximately 90 degrees Fahrenheit temperature produced very, very little of these influenza cells, influenza invaded cells. But when we look up at the 37 degree Fahrenheit or the 98.6 degree Fahrenheit, we see that human influenza did not do as well, did not fare as well after 72 hours as compared with the cooler temperature human influenza. However, avian influenza really thrived in the 72-hour period. It really grows best in higher temperatures. So, what can be done to reduce the risk of getting a high temperature when you have a virus that thrives in heat? What can you do to improve your immune system so that this can happen? Well, a couple things we need to go through then. First of all, the best way to prevent influenza from getting worse is to not get influenza at all. The reason why is because when you get influenza works well with bacteria in your body, bacteria that can actually cause problems in your lungs. The reason why is because when the influenza virus starts to replicate, for whatever reason, your body has a decreased production of a chemical known as lysozyme, which is normally antibacterial, and it decreases the amount of neutrophils, which are really the predominant white blood cells on patrol in your body. And they're actually the predominant cells in pus. The whitish yellowish appearance in pus is actually mostly neutrophils. Most commonly, they're the immune cell that will meet up with the pathogen. However, if influenza is resulting in these neutrophils not being in circulation, then you are more at risk for a bacterial infection. What would a bacterial infection do in combination with influenza virus? Well, bacteria will heat up the body. They will cause a fevered response. And so you definitely want to avoid getting the flu in general, because it can always bring, even if you have a healthy immune system, it can always bring about this co-partnering with bacteria to raise the temperature in the body using the fever mechanism we described earlier. Now, what can we do to prevent influenza? Well, washing our hands is undoubtedly one of the most important things. Drinking plenty of water so that we keep our nasopharyngeal, our upper airways nice and hydrated, and we don't have them becoming cracked and dried out. Also, ensuring that we have a proper cough reflex. If you get a little bit of itchiness or scratchiness in your throat, many people actually will run to the drugstore and take something known as a cough suppressant. This is deadly in terms of prevention of this type of influenza. Why is that? Because it suppresses the action in which your body is trying to expel impurities. So it's suppressing that reaction. And so it's basically keeping the secretions and foreign materials down there in the lungs where they can cause the most problems. Mucus and cilia. We need to keep these areas and these functions operating effectively. The mucus and cilia really operate like an ever-flowing stream of mucus on a conveyor belt. Smoking destroys and shuts down this conveyor belt. It stops the ciliated cells right in their tracks. It destroys them, and the lungs basically fill with mucus as a defense mechanism. Chilling also disrupts the function of cilia. We need to dress weather appropriate. And we may want to also avoid cow's milk just because of this reason, because it causes an overproduction of mucus in the airways. And last but not least, the immune cells, they're residing in the lungs. We need to keep them functioning effectively. The alveolar macrophages, for instance. These are a very, very vital dust clearing and debris clearing immune cell that actually live there in the lungs. They become activated and only live for a few days after activation, but they eat an enormous amount of debris, whether it be viral waste products or bacteria or even just general debris or dust that has been breathed in. These must be functioning properly in order to avert tissue destruction in avian type influenza. Interesting to note that mice, in laboratory studies, mice without these alveolar macrophages functioning properly had a significantly increased mortality rate when exposed to avian influenza. So they, many more of the mice succumbed to the influenza virus when these were destroyed. And so what can we do? Well, if you're smoking, definitely stop smoking. And if you need help in stopping smoking, which many people do, many people have a desire to stop smoking, but they just don't know how, please contact us at UT Pines to find out how you can get on a regimen and a program that will really help you stop. Not just hypothetically, not just maybe, but yes, we will help you to stop smoking if you want to stop smoking. Another thing we need to do is avoid those that smoke, because we don't want to breathe in smoke. Even if it's secondhand smoke, this will still kill the alveolar macrophages, it will still kill the cilia, and will still fill our lungs up with mucus. Dress weather appropriate, ventilate our homes and our office, because the EPA estimates that our indoor air is up to 5 times more polluted than outdoor air. So what does that tell you you need to do? Open your windows, let some of the fresh air come inside, and let some of the stale air go outside. Very, very essential in prevention of influenza. There's another look here at alveolar macrophages. They reside right here in the alveoli. And as you can see here, these macrophages have little arms that can protrude off of them, and they can go in many different directions at once, and they send out these arms and engulf the debris or whatever they need to bring back in, and they bring it back inside and destroy it. And so they're very, very essential defense mechanisms there in the very, very critical parts of the lungs, in the alveoli. Here's a picture of lysozyme. Lysozyme is a protein. It's found in tears. It's also found in mucus and in saliva. And its effectiveness in terms of its antibacterial propensity can be altered by increased amounts of salinity, such as increased salt intake, very, very high sugar intake, and dramatic changes in pH. Can kind of put these in a little bit of a shock at times. So it's important for us during flu season to avoid things like dried meats, which are filled with salt, dried fish, and so on. It might decrease the effectiveness of lysozyme for a short period of time. Also, chilling can affect this as well due to its effect on the cilia. Lysozyme is a key component of the upper respiratory system defense mechanisms, because without lysozyme, cilia would not actually flow in its wave-like pattern. Lysozyme is kind of like the key to the cilia's movement. Without the lysozyme, you don't have the cilia's movement as effectively. So if you think about how influenza works, it shuts down production of lysozyme. So in a sense, influenza is also slowing down the conveyor belt in the lungs. So it's really a dangerous combination. We really need to be looking at how can we prepare even right now to prevent this from happening to us, because once we get influenza, we already have it. Then it's treatment. But let's look at prevention right now more than anything. I'm going to look here at something that is really key in terms of prevention, and that is boosting our immune system. And in order to know how to boost our immune system, we really need to know some of the components of the immune system that we're going to be specifically addressing. We've already learned about alveolar macrophages. We're going to talk about natural killer cells, interferon. We've talked about neutrophils. And we'll also talk about something called acquired immunity, which are the B and T lymphocytes. Now, innate immunity is kind of something that everyone has innately going on 24 hours a day. These are your cellular patrol officers that are going around and doing their job, regardless of if there's a major disease or major infection that has been cited by the immune system. They're naturally working. The acquired immunity is kind of like when the government has to call out the National Guard, because it needs a greater amount of force to expel invaders or to solve a problem. And so the acquired immunity, the B and T lymphocytes, are used generally when there's a long-term exposure to something where you have a process of building up antibodies to it and these types of things. But the innate immune system in particular is the most essential component to prevention of new mutant influenza. Why is that? Because mutated influenza is mutated. So the body has not seen it before, has not had a chance to build up an adequate immune response to it and store it in its lymphocytes. And so the innate immune system needs to be functioning at its proper regulation. An article in the journal Nature, published in 2007, spoke of the avian 1918 influenza, and it had this to say about the avian influenza of 1918. It read, atypical or abnormal host innate immune responses may contribute to the lethality of these type of mutant influenzas. Why is that? Because the body is not actively waiting, not actively ready for these types of threats. If there is an abnormal immune response in the innate immune system, your body is not prepared to meet the invader. One of my most favored parts, or my favorite component of the innate immune system, is the natural killer cell. The natural killer cell is kind of like the elite commando of the immune system. We have many of these floating in circulation. We can boost them as well. We'll talk about ways to do that when we talk about lifestyle and influenza prevention. But natural killer cells travel around the circulatory system, travel around the tissues in the body, trying to find an invader, something new and foreign in the body. And they don't necessarily need a directive from the rest of the immune system to take care of a problem once they've identified it. Therefore, they're able to find new strains, new viral strains, and actually take care of them before the rest of the immune system builds up an attack plan. They're the first lines of defense, really, in terms of these new viruses. Even tumors can be killed by natural killer cells, even if the rest of the body is totally unaware of a tumor or a cancer that's growing in the body. The natural killer cell can go identify it and take care of it. It's kind of a one-stop shop for elimination of pathogens and cancerous cells in the body. Another component here of the innate immune response is interferon. When a virus enters into a cell, and you see here a depiction of how a virus enters a cell. The virus kind of goes over to the surface of the cell. It's encapsulated in the cell membrane, goes inside the cell. The change in pH, once it's it's taken into the cell, triggers the virus to break open its enclosure, and it sends its DNA, its instruction into the nucleus. It hijacks the transcription devices in the nucleus, and it produces itself. Instead of producing more of the cell, it takes over the cell and produces more viruses. Then it uses the cell's packaging devices and energy storage devices to package up viruses and send them out. Now, this is the way that some viruses work. However, some viruses will also not actually go directly out of the cell. They'll just build up and build up and build up in the cell. And once this happens, the cell actually explodes, and then the virons or the viruses are released into the circulation. Now, when something like this is going on inside the cell, there's kind of like a safety mechanism that the cell releases, a safety signal, similar to maybe like in a secret alarm button at a teller station or at a gas station clerk's cash register. The secret alarm that the cell sends out to the immune system is known as interferon. Interferon tells the immune system something is not right here. Be on the lookout for some strange events. Some strange invader is on the lookout. Interferon can alert the immune system to a major problem that is undergoing, even internally in the cells, undergoing transcription. Where do these cells come from? Well, they really come from the same stem cell. The hematopoietic stem cell, or the blood stem cell, can turn into two different types of stem cells that we're going to look at today. The myeloid stem cell, which can in turn into a red blood cell. It can turn into platelets. It can turn into eosinophils, basophils, or neutrophils, which are called granulocytes. They have similar functions. Eosinophils primarily will attack parasites, and basophils are also involved in an allergic response. Now, the lymphoid stem cells turn into something called a lymphoblast, and from the lymphoblast we have three different types of general white blood cells that are produced: the lymphocytes, the B and the T lymphocytes, and the natural killer cells also are produced as a result of this. And so if you thought of, what is a stem cell, this is a look at a stem cell. There's a lot of research that's being done on these things, but when it comes down to it, man looks into how these work, but God already knows. And so if we can follow out the principles and precepts God has given us in His Word, these things will be functioning properly. We don't need to worry about saving our blood stem cells, putting them in a bank somewhere, and manipulating them and injecting them into our body at a later state. What we need to do is live the best we can with the stem cells that we have right now, using God's plan for wellness. Immune cells are very interesting because not only do they float around the circulatory system, but they can actually go directly into the site of an invasion, a bacterial or viral invasion. Here, for instance, is a depiction of a neutrophil actually going inside of tissue. It was in the capillary system. It left the capillary, squeezed through the capillary, and went right into the tissue space where it could actually capture and destroy these pathogens. Now, when neutrophils actually go into the tissues, they only survive about 1 to 2 days. They're very, very active. And so it's very important for us to not only think, well, I'm going to prevent influenza today, and tomorrow I'll just indulge. It doesn't work like that. We need to constantly have our immune system working at top notch in proper function. We can't just live one day for good and the other day for evil. We need to live every day for good, because it's essential that our immune system is always functioning at its proper manner. Looking at another picture here of a neutrophil, this is a close-up view of a neutrophil actually engulfing anthrax. So you've heard of anthrax before. Very deadly when it gets in the lungs. Neutrophils can engulf and destroy anthrax. It's so essential for us to have our immune system functioning properly. It would really do us a world of good. What can we do then to ensure adequate immune system function? Well, there are many, many factors that play a role. We're going to touch on a few here. One of the first is dietary factors. Do you see the wonderful amount of colors right here? in the fruits and vegetables depicted. These colors are actually indicative of chemicals that are produced in the plant. These are known as phytochemicals. There are vitamins and minerals and other nutrients, and nutrients that we don't even know, we haven't even identified yet, that tremendously increase the immune system responsiveness. For instance, we'll go through just a couple here. Vitamin A, found in broccoli, carrots, sweet potato. Vitamin A can actually significantly suppress the fever response in influenza if it's caused by a secondary bacterial infection. Why is that? Because the bacteria fever-producing substances, components, are removed twice as fast with adequate vitamin A levels. Vitamin E, found in many nuts and grains as well, reduces the production of prostaglandin E2, which is something that can actually, it's kind of one of the end products of the arachidonic acid pathway. Remember we talked about this, how it actually turns up the thermostat in the hypothalamus. This is kind of like the two fingers right here, turning up the thermostat, the prostaglandin E2. It's how it kind of functions. Vitamin E can reduce the production of this, even if the body is going into a feverish state. A couple more here. Vitamin C decreases the levels of interleukin-6. Remember, we had interleukin-1 and 6 initiated from the white blood cells that bring about the fever response. Adequate levels of vitamin C can decrease the release of interleukin-6. Not only is it important to eat certain things, it's also important not to eat certain things. Because if we take a look here at the arachidonic acid pathway, we find something very interesting. We're going to skip a lot of the details here, and if you can just concentrate on the green areas and the two arrows here. There are two pathways in which inflammation can occur coming from the arachidonic acid pathway. Let's take a look at those two pathways on the screen. Prostaglandin E2, we find, is a byproduct of the arachidonic acid pathway. On the other hand, the other blue arrow points to leukotriene synthesis. Leukotrienes are asthma and bronchitis-related inflammatory compounds. Now, I'll just have a little aside here for a moment. Many people will try to eliminate prostaglandin E2 production by taking something like a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug like Tylenol, Motrin, or the like. What these do is they will block one component of the synthesizing mechanism in arachidonic acid, but it does not generally block the problem that is associated with leukotriene synthesis. So some people, they get rid of their headache, but they cause their asthma to go into a state of crisis. It's much more important for us, instead of trying to manipulate the minutia of this, to let God take care of the whole thing. Because when we live according to God's plan for our health, these things will be functioning properly. One thing that we can eat that truly should be shunned during this day of potential mutant influenza infection is something that also causes increase of prostaglandin E2 and causes arthritis and arthritic conditions. Nothing more than meat. The reason why is because meat contains arachidonic acid. It's basically like eating inflammation. And so what happens is when we put meat into our bodies, animal meat into our bodies, we put arachidonic acid right there where it can be either turned into asthma or turned into prostaglandin or arthritic conditions. Many people have totally gotten rid of their arthritic conditions by just going onto a plant-based diet. I know one individual in particular that would every morning would wake up, would take their bottle of prescription arthritic medication, anti-arthritic medications in their hand. They would struggle to open the cap, and they take their medication, and they could barely peel their fingers back off of the bottle. This person started drinking more water and started on a plant-based diet, and now they don't have really any problems at all with arthritis. And so it's really an essential component to to increasing our safety in this day and age. Now, if you don't think that's biblical, I want to take you over to Numbers 11, because everything that I've said to you today needs really to have a biblical foundation as well. If we take a look at Numbers 11:31, we find something very interesting. We find that in Numbers 11:31, this is a relation of the story of the Israelites lusting after meat, lusting after the quails. When they complained enough to Moses, asking for this meat, Moses said, okay, I'm going to ask God to send you some meat. And so God sent them quails, and He sent them quails. He sent them an abundance of quails. They had more quails than, it was almost like jumping into a huge mile-wide swimming pool of quails, basically. What happened to these people at that time was they went into a frenzy. They became riotous eaters of flesh, basically, at that time. They were sleep deprived. They were in a frenzied state of mind. They were eating and eating. They were stuffing themselves. They were packing quails into every single drying device they could find to save meat, to make some quail jerky and the like. So they had a very, very high protein, low antioxidant diet, increased meal frequency. They were snacking all the time on these quails, and then it hit them. The plague from the quails. In a rapid incubation period of less than 36 to 48 hours, many of them perished. Many of them perished. The reason why, we're told here in the commentary in Patriarchs and Prophets and Councils on Diet, it says they feasted without restraint and their excesses were speedily punished. But this is really the key here to diagnosing what really happened here. Burning fevers cut down very large numbers of the people. Burning fevers. We have two things going on here, two very significant things. One is we have burning fevers, and the other is we have avian virus being transmitted here, an avian virus. What does that mean? Well, could it be that this is the very first record of an avian influenza epidemic? If we take a look here at the way avian type influenza works, we see that after a certain amount of time, those that are in a feverish state will succumb to this influenza. The Israelites of old were definitely in a fevered state at this time. They were sleep deprived, they had a frenzied state of mind, high protein diet increases heat production as well, low antioxidant. They weren't eating those things that God had put into the plants to preserve them from this high fever. And so there was a consequence. Is there a consequence for the church today if we're eating intemperately, if we're not eating those things which God created for us to eat? If we're not even following the ideal diet? We know so much today. We have our Bibles in hand. Genesis 1:29. We're given, in Genesis 3 as well, we're given a plant-based diet in the beginning, in the very beginning. Wouldn't it be nice to return to that ideal diet again? When the book Counsels for the Church, on page 231, we're told that when the use of flesh food is discontinued, there is often a sense of weakness and a lack of vigor. Many urge this as evidence that flesh food is essential, but it is because foods of this class are stimulating, because they fever the blood and excite the nerves, that they are so missed. Didn't we see, scientifically speaking, that meat fevers the blood? It directly activates the arachidonic acid pathway. Why? Because it contains arachidonic acid. It contains inflammation, basically. So essential for us today to understand that this admonition does really apply to us. Because it says in Counsels for the Church, page 230, many who are now only half converted on the question of meat eating will go from God's people to walk with them no more. And it has been clearly presented to me that God's people are to take a firm stand against meat eating. Why is that? Because we want to be able to claim God's promises in that day when the destructive judgments of God are in the land. We want to be able to claim the promises of God by faith in His Word that we have followed and that we have persevered in heeding His admonitions. Because look at this promise here in Psalms 91, 5 through 6. It says, "Thou shalt not be afraid for the terror by night, nor for the arrow that flieth by day, nor for the pestilence that walketh in darkness, nor for the destruction that wasteth at noonday." It says in verse 7 through 8, "1,000 shall fall at thy side, and 10,000 at thy right hand, but it shall not come nigh thee." That's a tremendous death rate right there. If this were to happen today, only several 100,000 of people would be alive on the earth after this kind of epidemic. But it says here, "Only with thine eyes shalt thou behold and see the reward of the wicked," those who are not following God's precepts and provisions of Holy Scripture. What is the solution here? We don't know the way to go. The heart of man is deceitfully wicked above all things. Who can know it? Only God. But God can help us. He can search our hearts, and He can show us the correct way to live this life. A life of happiness, a life of holiness, a life of prevention, and a life of health. In Psalms 139, 23 through 24, we read, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts, and see if there be any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." Is it your desire today to find out more about how you can be led in this way everlasting? If it is your desire today, I'd like you to take some time to get to know the Lord better. Take some time today to ask Him, "Lord, show me your way. Lead me in your way of everlasting life."